no lizards, no aliens, no nonsense. This is Reality Bytes. Wake up!
Welcome to Reality Bytes Radio on the 20th of January 2015, 7 o'clock in the evening in Eastern Time, and well, it's midnight in the UK or GMT, and 1 hour ahead of that in Central Europe. I'd like to welcome to the show again Brandon Turbeville of BrandonTurbeville.com, writer for Activism posts and a number of other sites, as well as his own, of course. Welcome, Brandon.
Hey Neil, thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. I believe you've got a bit of a migraine, and myself and Paula just got back from being stuck in traffic for a few hours, so neither of us are feeling in the best of humours, I suppose. I want to talk to you first about Charlie Hebdo, then take it on to what you were saying. I think it was the 5th of January, your show on UCY.tv on the truth movement, and what direction you thought it would have to take, and I totally concur with you. But we'll talk about that later. And then move that on to what you were actually doing in December in a kind of proactive way and getting out and talking to people. But we'll start with Charlie Hebdo. In terms of any one of these attacks, everybody in the inverted commas truth movement immediately says false flag. Now, we know there are people out there who will commit atrocities like this. I'm not necessarily this crowd, but everybody immediately jumps to the conclusion. And the fact is, you can't jump out and say that's a false flag without having any evidence, regardless of how suspicious it looks. And you've gone through, I think it's 15 points on why you think that the Charlie Hebdo attack was a false flag operation. Do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of people in the alternative media will automatically, as you said, jump to the conclusion that it's a false flag attack, just like most people who watch the mainstream will automatically jump to the conclusion that it's not. Many of them don't have any concept of a false flag, of course, but I think there's danger in doing both. But at the same time, we've got to look at the historical case of these types of incidents. And when you have high-profile incidents like this, historically, at least in modern history, the last few decades, these kinds of attacks have been perpetrated by governments. So you look at the track record, and the track record is not that most of these attacks are indeed lone wolf terrorists. The track record is that they are indeed intelligence agencies and governments and militaries running these types of operations. So that is one reason for a lot of people to kind of knee-jerk go into the false flag realm. And also, I would say to people that whenever you're looking at these types of incidents, whether it's occurring immediately or whether it's occurred in the past, it's not your job to go out and look for every conspiracy possible, but it's not your job to ignore one when you find it. And as I said, when you look back into history, and especially in recent history, you look at these types of incidents and you find overwhelming evidence for these types of incidents being false flags. Now, in terms of the Charlie Hebdo massacre, there's just so much, and we can go into detail or not. But I have this article, 15 Signs Charlie Hebdo Attack Was False Flag, and as the article title says, there's 15 points that attempt to prove this, and one of them is quite basic. I mean, we have the main perpetrators, Sharif and Saeed Kouachi. Then, of course, you've got Koulibaly, the guy who held up the kosher grocery store, as well as his wife Boumediene, who was not in town for that, but she was considered as a part of it. But you got Sharif and Saeed Kouachi. These guys were veterans of the invasion of Syria, the NATO Western-backed invasion of Syria. In other words, they were in Syria. They were fighting against the secular government of Assad, fighting for, whether they knew it or not, the NATO, United States, UK, France, fighting for their geopolitical initiatives and their geopolitical agenda. We know that at least one of these Kouachis had made it to Syria to fight alongside the other terrorists there. Possibly both of these brothers had been to Syria to fight for these terrorists. And of course, as we've talked about on this show before, whenever you're talking about fighters in Syria, the opposition fighting against the Assad government, what you're talking about is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra. It's all the same thing. You can't just say, oh, opposition forces. They were fighting with the Free Syrian Army. Well, the Free Syrian Army is Al-Qaeda, it is Al-Nusra, it is ISIS, and to try to break those up into factions is really not doing anybody any good, because they're all the same thing. So in other words, Sharif and Saeed Kouachi were ISIS, or were Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call them. And if they are ISIS or Al-Qaeda, you got to look at who controls ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is documented, right? We've been through this on the show as well, and I've documented this on a number of different articles. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are controlled by NATO. They are controlled by U.S. intelligence, British intelligence, and French intelligence have something to do with it as well as Israeli intelligence, essentially Western intelligence agencies. Because I'd be hesitant to break the intelligence agencies up in terms of national borders either. So that's point number one. We also have the fact that, in terms of France specifically, France is responsible for arming and training and directing these terrorist organizations, just like the United States and the United Kingdom. Right? France has a history of funding terrorists. They did this when they overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in 2010, and you can look back and you can see how even Francois Hollande has admitted that France has been providing the terrorists operating in Syria with weapons, with logistics, with training, with all kinds of assistance. This is the same thing that they did to the Libyan rebels, who also were Al-Qaeda in Libya, overthrowing Gaddafi. So France is not some neutral player in this terrorism game. So it's not safe to assume that just because it's not the United States that it's not a false flag, or that this national government doesn't have a hand in supporting terrorism. The fact is that both of these suspects, Sharif and Saeed, had been on the radar screen of French intelligence for many years. This didn't come as a surprise. These guys could scarcely be considered a surprise to French intelligence, and the reason for that is one of them was on trial twice for terrorism in France. We've got Sharif Kouachi, who's probably the more famous. He was arrested in 2005 in France. He was charged and convicted of association with wrongdoers with the intention of committing a terrorist act. And he stayed in jail awaiting trial. He was in jail for about 3 years awaiting trial. But he, in 2008, even though he was convicted, his sentence was suspended on basically time served. They said he was in jail for 3 years awaiting trial, so they just commuted that 3 years that he spent in jail already to the overall sentence, and he was out in 2008. So the reason he was convicted, again, I said association with wrongdoers with the intention of committing a terrorist act. That terrorist act was joining jihadist fighters in Iraq to go fight NATO in Iraq. And he was allegedly under the sway of this crazy street preacher, this fundamentalist Farid bin Yato. We can talk about him a little more in a second. But after Kouachi had his trial, his sentence suspended in 2008, he was arrested again in 2010 in another terrorist attempt. He was going to break out this Algerian Islamist, and he bombed a Paris commuter rail. His name was Smain Ait Ali Belkacem. He was in jail, and Kouachi and his fellow plotters tried to break him out. The plot failed, and Kouachi got caught, was arrested, charged, but the charges were dropped. And that should be another clue. This guy's now committed and been convicted, or essentially arrested and prosecuted, convicted of one terrorist offense, and the second terrorist offense, the charges were dropped. So we have a lot of reports. CNN did a pretty good job by accident, I would imagine. The broken clock can be right twice a day, but CNN did a pretty good job of documenting some of these connections that Sharif had with other terrorist organizations. They report that he had a long history of jihad and anti-Semitism. And this guy, they had a 400-page court record that came out from 2007 during his first terrorism trial. And he was claiming that he wanted to go over to Iraq to fight the Americans because of the torture, the pictures that were coming out. And we also have again, this document was in the possession of law enforcement and the legal justice system and presumably intelligence agencies as well in 2007. So he was open about anti-Semitism, his hatred of Jews. He was open about jihad, plans for martyrdom, and all that kind of stuff. So he was affiliated with a group called the 19th Arrondissement Network. That was named for the arrondissement means 19th district in Paris. This was the neighborhood that it was located in, and it was involved in recruiting French Muslims to go fight for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it's the typical kind of Western-backed terrorist operation, right? The group would prey on disenfranchised, poor, working class, struggling young men, maybe uneducated, falling on hard times, disenfranchised with the system or with their life. And they would go out and prey on these guys and then attempt to radicalize them or pay them. This is another way these groups can get recruits, is that you get somebody who's been out of work or has no hope. You can pay them. People will do all kinds of things for money, or you can always pay half the poor to kill the other half. The group would organize weapons training for these guys. They would provide travel arrangement for the guys, and And this is what the group did. Sharif was a pizza delivery man. He had dropped out of school. He was lower working class. He fit the profile of somebody who would be recruited by these groups. And the official narrative that is coming out here is that he's just this gullible boy who fell under this, the spell of this street preacher called Farid bin Yato, who worked on the east side of Paris. Bin Yato was also convicted on terrorism charges, and he played a major role in setting up Sharif with the terrorist organizations that he had joined later to travel to Syria. But I want to point out that Bin Yato was never overseas fighting. He was never an on-the-ground fighter. Bin Yato was just a recruiter. And so I'd like to know a little more about this guy. We'll have to, hopefully somebody we can do some more investigation later, because this is the type of person who would represent a type of go-between. He's a recruiter. He's getting the cannon fodder to go to fight to Syria. So one would be interested in what his network, what his connections to French intelligence might be. Now, 2005, I would also want to point out that both Bin Yato, the 19th District organization that Sharif and Bin Yato were part of, had affiliations with this Ad-Dawa mosque, and this was one of the largest mosques in Paris. This is, sort of a fallback, a reminder, a flashback to the Finsbury Mosque in London. And the Finsbury Mosque, they used to joke and call London Londonistan for a reason, right? The Finsbury Mosque was one of the largest mosques there, and it's been implicated in a number of high-profile terrorist attacks. Anwar al-Awlaki was associated with this mosque as well. So what it is sort of a hub for really intelligence operations. This is where a lot of these people are recruited, and where a lot of these things are directed via proxies like Anwar al-Awlaki and other agents working for the Western intelligence. So this Bin Yato guy was supposed to have helped train the Kawachis through, setting them up with training to use Kalashnikovs, help brainwash them and teach them that they would die as martyrs and go to heaven and have 70 virgins and all that garbage. And what's interesting about Sharif is that he's in a way, he resembles Muhammad Atta. Now, he didn't torture cats and do anything like that like Muhammad Atta did, like a good psychopath. But what he was, when he was arrested, some of the court statements actually said that he seemed somewhat relieved that he had been arrested, so he didn't have to go and fight. Some of the lawyers and some of the other court records show that he was more interested in smoking pot and just listening to rap music than he was actually in jihad. The guy had a girlfriend. He wasn't married to her. All this type of stuff. They say he was more interested in chasing girls than going to the mosque. So he doesn't really fit the profile of a real hardened Muslim fundamentalist as much as he does, maybe a young person, a dupe who's looking for some guidance. And of course, the story is that once he met Bin Yato, he found everything that he was looking for. He found the fundamentalist Islam and all that kind of stuff. It's all the same story every time you see these patsies. The other brother is Saeed Kawachi, and this is a guy who received terrorist training in Yemen. Right, this is the officials, French officials and Yemeni officials have corroborated this, as well as a U.S. official. And in fact, the United States official says that the United States was given information from French intelligence. So the French gave information to the U.S. that said Saeed had traveled to Yemen as late as 2011. Working with Al-Qaeda, and that was also corroborated by a Yemeni journalist who said that he saw Saeed Kawachi there. And what's very interesting about Saeed Kawachi's stay in Yemen, they were at in the old city there, is that he had been a roommate of Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab. And if anybody doesn't remember that name, that is the reason why you get subjected to a sexual assault on the airlines before you get into a plane. This was the underwear bomber. This was the guy who tried to detonate a bomb in his underpants over Detroit on Christmas Day back in 2009, and then they had to install all the full body scanners that they had ordered a full year ahead of time. As a result, that former Homeland Security chief has stock in. But so Saeed Kawachi was a roommate of Abdul Muttalib. Now, what are the odds that one terrorist, a high-profile terrorist, would be rooming next to another high-profile terrorist in Yemen, out of all these countries in the world? And so this journalist and researcher, his name was Mohammed Al-Kibsi. He told CNN that he saw Saeed twice in Sana'a in Yemen in both 2011 and 2012. He said that he was researching the underwear bomber's background. That's why he was in Yemen. He was doing some research on the underwear bomber, and he came across Kawachi. And he said that Kawachi and Abdul Muttalib used to pray together at the Al-Tabari school, which was a school that where a lot of these Arab guys, or not, well, Arab guys, but a lot of the Muslims would go to learn Arabic grammar and study Arabic language. And so anyway, Abdul Muttalib and Saeed had roomed together. They lived across the hall from one another. And this is what is being claimed here. One of the possibilities that Saeed was actually trained in bomb making and some other terrorist skills in Yemen. And again, as I said, we have reports from a number of mainstream media reports. We had these reports coming from French intelligence, coming from U.S. intelligence, that, or at least that they were being promoted as that both brothers had returned from Syria this summer. And USA Today has both brothers going. CNN has one brother going. But what we know is at least one brother went. And as I said earlier, if they are in Syria fighting against Assad, then you can bet you can label them ISIS, you can label them Al-Qaeda, and you can bet that they're being controlled by the United States and by NATO, whether they know it as dupes at the bottom or not. So what I would ask is, if Sharif Kawachi could be arrested in 2005 for association with wrongdoers with the intention of committing a terrorist act, then why wasn't he arrested for the same thing in 2015? Why would he not have been arrested when he came back from Syria? Why were these brothers not arrested when they came back to France from Syria or Yemen, after they had received training from a terrorist organization, after they had committed terrorist acts, after they had just the association with these organizations? Why weren't they arrested then?
Well, I mean, are these guys French citizens at all? I doubt it very much. Why weren't they deported after the first crime when they served their time? Why weren't they just thrown out of the country if the authorities knew that they were up to no good and were committed to do, to taking part in more terrorist activity? Why would they even have them in the country?
Yeah, well, actually, I think they were French citizens. They were of Algerian descent. They were born in France. This might seem a little foreign to some people who might take a look at these guys and say, well, he doesn't look French at all. Well, that's kind of the point. It's with the waves of immigration that have come into France, you can go into some areas of France and scarcely know that you're even in France. Maybe some of the architecture might give it away, but otherwise you'd think you were in Algeria.
Well, I mean, some parts of London are like that as well, in fairness, and some of the southern English cities, I suppose. But well, I mean, again, if the guys are born in France, they're French citizens. I mean, all it does is it reinforces the belief in the indigenous, I'll call them indigenous French people, that all Muslims are terrorists. It doesn't matter if they're French citizens or not, and we should all be afraid of them. Yeah,
and if I could just continue here a little bit, Neil, I've got a couple more things to mention. I mentioned Anwar al-Awlaki, right? If people don't know the name Anwar al-Awlaki, this was a prominent, he was allegedly killed by a U.S. drone strike, also killed his 16-year-old son, allegedly, but he was a prominent sheikh, a Muslim sheikh, who was involved in a number of high-profile terrorist incidents, whether it was the underwear bomber was one. We had Nidal Malik Hassan, that was the Fort Hood shooter. We also had Nawaf al-Hazmi, Khalid al-Midar, Hani Hanjour. These were the 9/11 attackers. All these guys had connections with Anwar al-Awlaki, and what it seems to be pointing to is that Anwar al-Awlaki was actually an intelligence asset, right? This is Webster Tarpley called him Anwar al-Awlaki, the CIA lackey, right? In fact, he labeled him a double agent as well, and I think this is what it points to. Remember, it was Anwar al-Awlaki, he's such a radical sheikh, and he's got all these terrorist connections, but he died at the Pentagon only a few months after 9/11, and that's a matter of public record. So the Sharif and Saeed connections to this Awlaki guy as well, but obviously before he was killed. And of course, in the 15 signs that the Charlie Hebdo attack was false flag, I go into a number of connections that these terrorists had. Right, it wasn't just the terrorist organizations that I mentioned that they had connections to. They had connections to a number of other terrorists. Right, they had a connection to Dajamel Begal or Abu Hamza. He was serving a 10-year prison sentence for a plot to blow up the U.S. Embassy in 2001. He was connected to the Finsbury Mosque. And
Hello? I think we've lost Brandon. Oh, damn it. Hello? Ah.
Right, Neil,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
I'm sorry, I think the technical difficulties were on my end there.
Okay, no problem. Carry on. You were talking about Abu Hamza, and most people in the UK would know who he is. He's the guy with the hook.
Yeah, so all these guys, they had connections. He had connections to the Finsbury Mosque, again, in London. That is the basically one of the hubs for terrorist recruitment and terrorist operation run by U.S. intelligence and British intelligence, MI6, and as well. They also had connections with this Salim bin Khalim. That's another Frenchman, I guess you would call him, of Algerian descent. They had a friend, Buchnak, his name, that was his name, that's all I have on him, but he was also involved in a number of terrorist organizations. Belkacem, which I mentioned earlier, and we could go on, but what you have here, and again, this is in the article if anybody wants to see it, it gets pretty detailed, and if you want me to go through it, we can, but essentially what you have is a terrorist cell. This is not a lone wolf organization. This is not Saeed and Sharif Kouachi and even the Koulibaly. This is not a three-man team. These connections reach across France, across to Yemen, across to London. This is a terrorist network. And again, when you look at terrorist networks, you are looking at the handiwork of U.S., British intelligence, Anglo-American intelligence, as well as French intelligence. So we've also got, just to talk about this Hayat Boumediene, right? This is the wife, the common-law wife of Koulibaly, the kosher grocery store guy. She was, reported to have been part of of the plot, but we have allegedly video footage and pictures of her actually crossing into Syria on January 8th, which tell us that she was not in town for the killing, for the Charlie Hebdo attacks and for the kosher grocery store attacks. But still, again, all these connections that they show us that what we have here is a terrorist cell. Of course, Koulibaly was a close friend of Sharif Kawachi. Again, this not the media has even tried to promote the kosher grocery store killing as a completely separate and independent incident, as if Coulibaly had nothing to do with Sharif Kawachi. I mean, as if these terrorists who have all these same connections to one another and to the same clerics and the same mosques committed terrorist attacks of a very similar variety on the same day at the exact same time, completely free and independent of one another. I mean, are they trying to tell us that there's some type of jihadi, Carl Jungian, collective unconsciousness with the jihadist network or something? This is beyond belief. But Coulibaly actually told the individuals that he was holding up, this was reported to CNN affiliate, that he was a member of the Islamic State of ISIS, right? So this was reported in French media as well. Coulibaly was also involved in that attempt to free Belkacem in France. So, as I said, these guys are part of an organized terrorist network, and that points to British and U.S. intelligence. We also have what's common in these types of situations. We have whether or not there's a third suspect, right? We had this guy Murad Hamid. This was initially, they said there were 3 killers at the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and Hamid was one of them. But turns out this guy was home and he was playing on Facebook or Twitter, and he saw his name being bounced around as one of the 3 killers, and he turned himself into police, and obviously he had nothing to do with it. But there was a third suspect, and there was a third suspect. They were so sure that there was a third suspect that they could actually produce the fact that it was a male, and they could produce a description that met Murad Hamid's description. So where did this third suspect go? When Hamid turned himself in, where did the third suspect go? Is there still a third suspect? Are they still looking for him, or do they just drop that idea altogether? When we have the situation at the kosher grocery store, we have a second suspect, right? Coulibaly was allegedly alone, but then they said, no, Hayat Boumediene was involved in this as well. And when it turns out that she had gone to Syria, well, where's the second suspect? There was someone else involved, right? And they could tell us that it was Hayat. Well, she was in Syria. Where's that second person? Did that person vanish into the memory hole, or is that person still being searched for? We've got the question of the suicides, right? We had the police commissioner, Helrik Fredu. He was investigating the attack and just recently killed himself. He was the police commissioner, and that was reported. They said that he had a history of depression and all this kind of stuff. Well, we don't know about all that, but this seemed like a very strange time to kill oneself. But allegedly, that's what happened. This is with the Kennedy assassination, with 9/11, we have a number of very strange suicides. It's always funny, the people with the most information, the investigators, the eyewitness reporters, they tend to be the most prone to suicide. So we also have this is sort of tangential. I mean, I almost hesitate to mention this, but we have a strange meeting between Coulibaly and Sarkozy back in, I think this was 2009. Sarkozy went out and to this factory. It was a photo op, and you can actually see pictures of Coulibaly shaking Sarkozy's hand and saying not unpleasant things about him, basically saying that, well, he's not very popular, but I was very happy to meet him because he's the president, and that sort of thing. So I'm just throwing that out there. Then what we mentioned earlier was the idea that one of the attackers left his ID. This was one of those clownish things that really should throw up a red flag, right? We had one of the attackers dropping his ID in the car and leaving it there. Now it's not entirely unbelievable to say that somebody who just committed a terrorist act would be so panicked as to drop their ID in the car if they had decided to bring their ID along with them when they committed the terrorist act to begin with. But this is just one of those things that like the paper passports that survive fire, fire that can melt steel beams but not paper passports. And it's just one of those things that is very coincidental that the guy would have hopped out of the car and left his ID just right there in the seat for the investigators to find and then identify. And of course, we had the fact that the terrorists were killed. In any type of anti-terror operation, sometimes this may have to be the case, but generally when you have situations, we had, remember the Zarnev brothers, they weren't killed, but they were rendered unable to speak. The guy was shot in the throat. If he survived, it was by accident. We had other patsies like Sirhan and James Holmes, so they weren't killed, but they were rendered so incredible with their stories or their mental sanity that they couldn't be taken seriously. But most of these guys are generally either killed in the act, or as in this case, they were killed as a result of the police action. They were liquidated, so dead men can tell no tales. And just to kind of go through this, we've got the fact that France, of course, is using this to drum up support for anti-Islamic, Islamophobia, and of course as the time-honored method of fighting terrorism, right? Justifying military action abroad. But it turns out that France had ordered an aircraft carrier to the Gulf the day before the attacks in France. So obviously it was that announcement was overshadowed by the terrorist attacks at Charlie Hebdo, but also the attacks themselves provide retroactive justification for that aircraft carrier being put into the Gulf to fight ISIS, right? And so there's two other questions, and Neil, you can stop me here if I'm ranting.
Rant on. It's okay.
All right. So we've also got this, two questions here about the timing of the attacks, right? First of all, in December 2014, we had the lower house of the French Parliament voting to recognize a Palestinian state. That is not the will of the oligarchy to recognize a Palestinian state and to allow the Palestinians to gain any type of recognition as human beings. Now, that vote was not going to really affect France's foreign policy, but what it was a symbol of sort of a changing of the tide in popular opinion regarding this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it's reached a point now where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so obvious as to what it is that even people with a lot of blind prejudice are starting to have a hard time justifying it, although they try. But we also had some statements coming by Francois Hollande that the sanctions on Russia were counterproductive and that it was time for the sanctions on Russia to end. And this obviously again is not the Anglo-American party line here. So one wonders if whether or not this is some type of message also, not only in justification for military action in the Middle East, but whether it's not some type of geopolitical message to Hollande to get back onto the reservation. And lastly, I would want to point out about this Charlie Hebdo magazine. I'm all for free speech. I'm certainly for free speech, but this Je suis Charlie thing, France is not a country of free speech. I don't care how many times they can say they support freedom of expression. That blowfish Hollande has no clue what freedom of expression is. The French people do not have that. And this magazine, I'm certainly not with the other, the lefties who go out and try to blame Charlie Hebdo for the terrorist attacks and say that it's your fault for being bombed because you insulted somebody's religion and they can't handle their religion being questioned. But Charlie Hebdo, I have to question what this magazine really serves as, because what it's done for years is it has attacked Christianity, it's attacked Islam, and it's been intentionally provocative. Remember, it was firebombed in 2011 because they had a caricature of Muhammad on the cover, and they've done this in the past, a number of times in the past. They've reprinted the Danish cartoons that got so many religious freaks up in arms about, because they depicted the Prophet Muhammad in human form. But what it's done is it's happened on occasions where it served the purpose of the oligarchy, right? To stir these people up, and not only in Europe but across the Muslim world, to create all types of disturbance and tension. And as far as France being a nation of freedom of expression, I heard Francois Hollande say that he was basically suggesting that a lot of these people in the Muslim world, they don't understand freedom of art or freedom of expression or freedom of speech because they've never had it. Well, isn't that funny? Because there was a columnist for Charlie Hebdo who made a statement that he made some joke about Sarkozy's son. He said that his son was converting to Judaism for financial gain. Basically, he was I think his son was marrying a Jewish woman, and this columnist made a joke that he was going to convert so he could get some money. But this man was fired, and he was actually put on trial. So how's that for freedom of expression, right? The act of denying the Holocaust is punishable, a crime, right? This is, the idea of denying the Holocaust is one thing, but the idea of punishing it is another, right? When you cannot even question something, that is not freedom of expression. I mean, remember Bob Dylan was actually charged with inciting racial hatred for an offhand comment that he made, which was anything but inciting racial hatred. And so apparently you can attack some religions. Hollande, in the same breath, he said that these people don't understand freedom of expression. In the same breath, he said that they needed to punish the protesters who burned the French flag because that couldn't be tolerated. So there's your freedom of expression in France.
Yeah, hypocrisy in totality. I suppose the thing that happened with Francois Hollande, he kindly accepted the Queen of England's condolences for the loss of some French citizens, and I think she should have actually thanked him, because on the same day Andrew, the pervert of Wales, disappeared off the front pages of the British newspapers for his alleged mishaps with underage girls, and who knows, boys possibly, I don't know, and his affiliation with Jeffrey Epstein. That was one consequence of it. And of course, immediately we're starting to see more draconian laws coming into place. And as you say, a clampdown on free speech, when that's the whole thing they're supposedly advocating that we should all be, guarding. And one thing that struck me with the Je suis Charlie things was that almost immediately after this attack, all these posters appeared. Now, you can't just walk into a printer and say, "Give me 10,000 of these, please." It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. It doesn't matter how patriotic the French guy is. He ain't going to run out 10,000 posters just like that and get them all handed out.
You see, it's a collective unconsciousness thing again. Everybody was just going out and printing the same poster, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. I just writing something else down here. Again, you mentioned the underwear bomber, and his connections to all these other people, and Al-Awlaki, and all of them. And as you say, if we've got free speech, I mean, it's bringing me on to what I was going to talk about next when you did your talk on the truth movement and where it was going and where it was going wrong, basically. We should. I've always been an advocate of using the terminology that they use against us. Like, if you've nothing to hide, if not to fear, you've nothing to hide. So let's talk about it. There's your free speech. Now, somebody could have phoned up any local radio station in Britain on that day, or a week later, say, and say, here's some information on the Charlie Hebdo attack. Are you willing to adhere to the right of free speech and let me have my say? and put it to them that that's what they're asking for. So here it is. Here's my opinion. Are you going to listen? You know.
Yeah, and just see the reaction that they get, and that is the when you mentioned my talk on the radio about that. Yeah, basically what disturbs me about what you call the truth movement is that a few years ago it was much better in terms of how people tried to engage in activism, right? Because the goal was to reach out and to get new people in, right? It was to reach out to somebody who didn't know the facts about 9/11. It was to reach out to tell somebody about carbon taxes or whatever your issue was, or all the issues taken together. The goal was to reach out and inform people who didn't know about it to begin with. And over the a couple of years, as these alternative media grew, it's not really become that anymore. It's become clickbait. It's become, how can I get the people who are already aware of this information to come to my website instead of yours? And that is that to me, that's pathetic. You're in this for a money making scheme. We're going to be a big fish in a really small pond, but the idea is to bring more people in. And at one point, a lot of individuals in the alternative media were doing that. They were calling up radio shows. They were starting their own shows and reaching out to other people, not just other people in the alternative media, but reaching out to people out in the community. They were getting radio shows and little public access TV shows. They were handing out flyers. They were burning up DVDs and handing out the DVDs. They were giving public lectures. They were doing all this kind of stuff, and it was having an effect. I mean, it took some determination. It took people, putting up with a lot of disagreement, a lot of people who weren't happy with what they were saying at first, but it was having an effect. If you go back and think about those times, the people who were handing out those DVDs and were showing up to events and handing out information, these people did have an effect. I can't emphasize that enough. And it didn't just happen overnight. You had to keep working at it. But the fact that all of that stopped is extremely concerning to me. And I think that I just want to encourage people to, especially those of them in the alternative media, to stop trying to compete with one another and refocus this whole thing and think about what you're really in this for, and try to get this information out to other people. And for people who aren't in the alternative media, who do know a lot of this information, that what are you so afraid of? If you're listening to this radio show, you're on a list, so you might as well go out and try to bring more people into it, because you're not getting away from the big machine here. If you own a cell phone, they know what they know your sentiment. If you have the internet, they know your sentiment. They know what you think about these issues. They know you're aware of it. So you might as well get out and try to use this window of opportunity while you can.
Yeah, I mean, myself and some colleagues in Ireland when I lived there, we published a newspaper. We did 6 editions of it, and it was really popular, and we just basically handed out most of them for free, and we had some people put some money in, and we printed them all up, and they were full of stories from all over the world. A lot of them originally written by myself and others, and some cut and pasted from other people with their permission, and that had an effect as well. And then we did some conferences on the back of that, because we'd given the papers out for nothing. We didn't know who was getting them. We didn't know if people knew anything at all, and we were getting 400, 500 people at some of these conferences, and on the back of that, obviously charging for tickets and getting speakers over. But we lost money on every one of them, and we eventually just gave up because people just got apathetic, But in terms of the local radio stations, I was phoning them up every week, very, very easily. I was kind of fortunate enough to live on the border of 3 counties in Ireland, so I got 3 different local radio stations, and they had the talk show on at 10 o'clock every morning on all 3 of them. So I just scanned them and see what they're going to talk about and say, okay, I can phone in about that. And one case was they were talking about the water quality being very poor in parts of Ireland, and they were talking about sediment in the water. I just phoned up and said, it's not the sediment you want to worry about, it's the fluoride. And I was on it for half an hour, and I went through the history of fluoride and the Nazis and all this, and the guy said to me at the end of it, so why is it in the water? I said, well, you tell me. And he just went deathly quiet, and things like that. And it's so easy to do, because, as I mentioned off air, they're talking about cats stuck up trees, and has anybody seen my dog Patch? He's run away. kind of things like that. And as soon as somebody comes on with something controversial to say, they're all over you.
Yeah, and the thing is, this is information, as you said, that doesn't, this is not discussed at all in the mainstream. So when people hear this information, it jogs something with them. I mean, it gets them talking. When I gave my my last lecture on the Syria crisis, it definitely got people talking, and you can see it up there on the website now. But a lot of this stuff, you can make it expensive if you want to, with materials and setups and stuff. But you can do a lot of this stuff for free. You talked on that radio show; it didn't cost you anything. And some people are great writers. Then put that to use, and not just the internet. There's a whole world out there that outside of the internet, and put it to use. Write an article, put it on a piece of paper, and hand it out to somebody, or maybe slip it into magazines at the doctor's office. People are stuck there for hours and they have nothing to read. So, if you're a good talker, then why not try to get on a local radio station, or why not organize your own lecture or presentation? Everybody's got their own talents, and I think they can be put to use. You'd be surprised the effect that you could have just by not talking about doing something and just doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I said at the start. You have to have the evidence. You can't just go on and then phone up and say, "Oh, this happened, blah 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 blah." You need to, be articulate enough to get that across, that you know what you're talking about, and you challenge them to prove you're wrong, and that's the way to go about it. And they soon cut you off. I mean, the fact that they cut you off must strike a chord with people who are listening who know nothing. They say, well, why have they cut that guy off?
Exactly. Yeah, we had, I think it was the Washington Journal here. It was a morning show on C-SPAN. And they took live calls, and they must not have screened the calls for years, because people would call in, and every morning it was a volley of people calling in and talking about 9/11 and the Federal Reserve, and it was just hang up after hang up after hang up, to the point that it got so obvious that anybody that was talking about these issues would immediately be shut down.
Well, I mean, again, I've said this to people before. I said we need to pick an issue one day, and we all phone the same radio station on that day, and nobody does it. They just won't do it. It's very difficult to get anybody to do anything. That's part of the problem. But I'm kind of in a funny situation here in America, because I'm here on a tourist visa, and I'm not allowed, and it states it on the visa, I'm not allowed to take part in any form of journalistic activity. There's freedom of speech for you. I've kind of got to be a bit careful. I mean, this is I could be thrown out of the country for doing this, I guess. So if you're listening, Homeland Security, well, you know where I live anyway, so I'll expect a knock on the door fairly shortly.
Well, you should declare jihad. You'll be fine.
Yeah. I'll change my name to something Mexican or something. Who knows? I mean, it is very easy, and anybody who can. I phoned up English stations and Irish stations with a Scottish accent, and most of the time I'd say they probably caught maybe one or two words out of every 3 or 4. But at the same time, there's a lot of very articulate people out there who could, phone up and quite calmly and collected put the facts across to people, and wait for the reaction of the host of that station, and have the answers ready, because these local radio hosts have no idea whatsoever of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I would advise people also to take a step back and realize that the information that you have had for the last few years is sort of Greek to most people. So it might not be a good idea to hit a person with the Federal Reserve, 9/11, chemtrails, technotronic warfare all at the same time, because maybe that's not as easy to grasp. But
well, I mean, actually, the last time I was in England, there was a local radio station there. It's called Three Counties, actually, just coincidentally. It was called Three Counties, and the host there is such an obnoxious, I'll just call him a wanker, because that's what he was. He was talking about the quantitative easing and stuff like that. Do you think it's a good idea? And I phoned them up and said, I think it'd be a good idea if the government actually printed its own money instead of borrowing it from the Bank of England. And he laughed and said, Neil thinks we should just print money. I said, what do you think quantitative easing is? And he cut me off, of course. But, I said, that's how dumb he's not. He was, he's one of these guys who pushes the whole behavioural insights team stuff about organ transplants and all that kind of stuff, organ donors, and you're selfish if you don't donate your body to science and all that rubbish. Regardless of your religion or whatever you believe in, because free speech doesn't matter to these guys. You can't have an opinion. But yeah, I suppose in terms of you're saying don't hit them all with 9/11 and the Federal Reserve and stuff. But if you can put it in simplistic terms, because at the end of the day, the people listening to those radio shows are listening with simplistic ears, right? And you have to talk at their level, if you like. I'm not be disrespectful to people that are listening, but they're so used to listening to the party line, as it were, that you have to speak to them in the same kind of patronising tone, I guess, without coming across as patronising, of course.
Yeah, you do, and what I'm just saying to people is that because that so many people have been trained to listen to that stuff in that way for so long that the first time I heard about chemtrails, I thought the person telling me it was crazy, and if I thought that, then what does the average person think when you're talking about that stuff? So I think it's better not to overload people sometimes whenever you talk to them, that they just can't handle it, I think. But there's a time to go all the way with some people if they're asking the questions. But yeah,
a very good one that I've been on radio about, a couple of times actually in Ireland, I think once in England as well, was vaccines, because they have the usual round of you better get your flu jab for the flu season coming up, or there's a whooping cough epidemic, so you need to get this and that and the next thing. And you because you can get access to the vaccine inserts online or wherever, and it states the contraindications in them. You can say, hold on a minute, I'm reading from the actual Novartis pack insert for this particular vaccine, and it says it's never been tested on pregnant women, and yet you're telling me it's safe for pregnant women. And right. that's just a basic fact, and people will go away and look at it then, because they can check it, or at least ask the doctor.
Yeah,
and the doctor won't know.
It's an issue that can be grasped, and what I find interesting, a lot of times with the vaccine issue is that a lot of these people don't even understand. And I'm talking about educated people here. People in the medical profession don't even know what things like adjuvants in the vaccines are. All they know is what they were told in nursing school or medical school or pharmaceutical school. A lot of these guys won't even know what you're talking about, and they could be the doctor.
Well, exactly, because I've never heard of anybody actually being given a vaccine insert, and yet in the UK it's actually the law that they're supposed to explain every detail of every vaccine they give you, the pros and cons. I don't think there's many pros, if any, at all, and the cons are certainly there to see. But they're breaking their own. It's actually called the Green Book. I know we're getting off subjects like that, but it's called the Green Book, and it's supposed to be the guidelines for all doctors. And there's a specific section there on vaccinations and stuff and what they're supposed to tell you. And I don't think I've heard of any one of them that's ever followed it through and done it properly.
Well, the health departments here in South Carolina will actually, this is where you get the vaccine exemption forms. And you can only get a religious exemption form. But the health departments will actually lie to you and tell you that those forms don't exist, that there's no such thing as a religious exemption form. And then you have to threaten to sue them. And then suddenly, oh, yeah, it's over here, and it's in this file hanging on the wall here. This is the religious exemption. But they'll lie to you. So will the schools. They'll look in your eyes and lie to you and tell you that they don't exist, but they do. But what's funny, you mentioned the just the word outbreak. A lot of people may have heard about the whooping cough outbreaks over the last few years. Look up those statistics. They're considering an isolated case of whooping cough. One child in one county catches whooping cough, and that's considered an outbreak.
Well, I think there's figures out there to show that 95% of those cases were already vaccinated as well. So
Yeah.
what does that tell you? And I mean those numbers again can be proven from official sources. So I mean, we're just talking about vaccines, but it could be any kind of number of things. It could be fluoride, it could be anything. But there are official sources out there that you can actually state on air and dare them to question you.
Well, look at the CDC. You can look at their facts and their statistics, and what you find is that 30,000 people a year do not die of the flu. It's more like 15. And most of the people who are diagnosed with the flu don't have the flu to begin with. They have a flu-like illness. And that comes from the CDC. I've documented that in my articles and in a lecture I did. So, in fact, if people want to see that, it's called The Needle and the Damage Done. I'd encourage them to take a look at that on YouTube, because I try to bring all this stuff together, and I post up the statistics from the CDC there. But it comes straight from their organization. You look at the statistics the year after. That's when all the information is in, and you find out that this is all a bunch of hype, and that the vaccine doesn't do anything.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Brandon, we're going to have to wrap it up there because Paula's on next with a guest she's got ready to come on. So we'll talk again next month, possibly?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Thanks for coming on with your headache and all that, and thanks for sticking with it. Okay,
Thanks
talk
for
to you again
having me.
soon. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.